Good morning, everybody. I'm a little bit scratchy this morning, so I thought to myself, you know what, when it comes to the worship time, I'll just kind of whisper the words a little bit and save my voice, but I was so moved by our time of worship, I couldn't. I just had to sing out, and I just was overcome with the presence of God this morning. I marvel sometimes at just the talent and giftedness that God has brought to our church, the hard work that our music, our tech teams do to lead us into God's presence. You want me to just thank them for just the way that they lead us so well? Quick update before we get to the message. If you've been looking out to the east of our building, you know that the area for our inclusive playground has been taking shape. It's got sidewalks, it's got curbs, it's got ramps, it's got patios, it's got everything except playground equipment. But it looks like this week the equipment will start to be installed. So we're very excited about that, so be looking forward to that. You know, anytime you gather a group together to accomplish something, getting that group on the same page and getting that group to stay on the same page is incredibly difficult, isn't it? I mean, we see it in all kinds of different organizations. If you have a great company, maybe you start out with a mission, a focus of making a great product. But over time, the company can be more focused on increasing stock valuation. A military institution can have a clear goal to get the best equipment and the best personnel to protect the nation. But sometimes they can kind of veer off course in promoting an ideology. Sometimes pro sports franchises are bought by owners because they want to win championships for a city. But then over time, they become more concerned about revenue and profits as opposed to putting the best product out on the field. Sometimes a political party exists to support great candidates who will enact helpful legislation for the people. But then they veer off course and become obsessed with winning and staying in power instead of actually getting something done. George Williams was a man who started a Bible study for displaced men in London, England, decades ago. He had a core mission to not only help these men learn about Christ, but to raise them up and to deploy them into the gospel mission. In his lifetime, he and his organization trained and commissioned more than 20,000 missionaries that went around the world. His organization was called the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA. As the organization grew and expanded to other countries, eventually they lost focus and became about health and fitness with little reference to Christ, so much so that in 2010, the organization officially dropped the other three letters of its name and now is simply known as the Y. No longer sticking with its ties to its Christian roots. True of most any organization is also what's true of the church. We are gathered here to accomplish something together. God has pulled us together to accomplish something. We have a primary mission. But sometimes with all the activity and all the things that go on in the life of the church, we lose sight of what we're really supposed to do. We lose sight of our mission. So the question for this morning is, what are we called to do? If you haven't been with us, we're in week 3 of our series called North Star. We're thinking about these issues that all of us are really interested in. Identity, purpose, direction. All of us are wanting to be right in the middle of that. We said just as the North Star is in a fixed position in the sky that orients travelers and helps them find direction, we said too in a similar way, God is our creator and sustainer of all things. He occupies a fixed position of authority in the sky, in our lives, if you will, and that finding our true calling involves us orienting ourselves to Him. That any ability we have to find purpose and direction first calls us to orient ourselves to the North Star, so to speak. Our calling is not a quest for personal fulfillment or accolades of some kind, but instead our purposes and callings are all about reflecting Him, reflecting the one who is the creator and sustainer of all things. Last week we talked about being adopted into God's family. We were asking the question of who are we called to be? And we said that this idea of being a member of God's family is central to any understanding of identity and ultimately purpose that we have. And we said that if any of us are going to find our unique place in the world, we first need to find our place within God's family and then find our spot within it. In this series, we said we're going to develop a framework of calling. This idea of calling can be kind of ambiguous or slippery. So we said, what if we put a framework together around this to help us think about this and how to articulate it. So I said last week we were borrowing extensively from a book called More by a man named Todd Wilson. But he says, I think there's three big questions everybody has to work through in terms of discovering a sense of purpose and calling. The first one is, who am I called to be? What am I called to do? And where am I called to go? So we're working through those questions. And we said last week that before we can work through any of those questions individually, we have to work them through collectively, because we are part of a group of people, the family of God. We need to understand the we before we can understand the me. And so last week, after we kind of worked this through and asking this question of who are we called to be, we started to think through implications of who am I called to be. Well, today we go to the question of what are we called to do? And what we kind of discover today is that to understand our own place, we need to understand the central task that's been assigned to God's people so that we can find our part in that. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 4 this morning, and it's a very kind of simple text, probably one that a lot of you are familiar with. And we're working through this question of what are we called to do? What does this text tell us about what we're called to do? It's a short passage, and it's going to be on the screen. I'm going to ask you to read it aloud with me. Here we go, Matthew 4, starting in verse 18. One day, as Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, also called Peter, and Andrew, throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. Jesus called out to them, "Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people." And they left their nets at once and followed him. A little farther up the shore, he saw two other brothers, James and John, sitting in a boat with their father, Zebedee, repairing their nets. And he called them to come too. They immediately followed him, leaving their boat and their father behind. Like I said, probably a familiar text to a lot of us. This scene takes place in the northern part of Israel, in the region that's known as Galilee. Jerusalem is kind of more in the southern part, in the region known as Judah, or Judea, and this is up in the northern part in Galilee. There's a great body of water there called the Sea of Galilee, and there's a capital city there known as Capernaum, where most likely the Jesus and the disciples spent most of their time. And so this whole episode happens probably there. Now we're trying to understand our sense of calling here, but what we see here is that there's two sets of brothers. Jesus goes up to them and offers them basically the same invitation, the same calling, if you will. And by looking at this, I think there's some things for us to discover about this idea of purpose and calling by both what Jesus said and how they responded. So let's just think for a minute about what we learn, what we get a sense of about what we're called to do through this passage. The first thing is this: we are called to follow Jesus. That seems kind of obvious, right? We're called to follow Jesus. In the first century, it was common for a Jewish rabbi to have a group of students who would travel with him and learn from him. And it's kind of part of the pattern. A prospective student would go to the rabbi and say, "May I have the permission to study with you, to follow you around, if you will?" So this was not really an uncommon idea, except what's different here in this situation is that Jesus is the one who takes the initiative. He invites. He calls. And as he gives this invitation, some people might say, this feels kind of abrupt. He walks up to total strangers and says, "Follow me," and they kind of take off and go with him. Well, that's not really the way this unfolds. You see, they had a lot of opportunity to discover who Jesus was well before this invitation came forward. They had a chance to get to know who he was and discover enough about him to know that he had uncommon wisdom, uncommon authority, uncommon care for people, and was worthy of following. If you kind of pull all the four gospel passages together, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, pull all those books together and kind of harmonize them, and you kind of go through the whole timeline, you discover that in John chapter 2, Jesus performs his first miracle when he changes water into wine at Cana. And it says the disciples are with him, and they begin to see for the first time that he has miraculous power and authority. I tell you that because this invitation to follow him came about a year later. So they had seen several episodes, several things unfolding in the life of Jesus. They had time to discover that he was unlike anybody else. that he was worthy of following. And so this invitation of Jesus is to follow him. It's not merely to be a church attender or to be a nice moral man or woman or to buy his book or listen to his podcast. His invitation is to follow him. And when he calls for this, this kind of invitation, this kind of calling goes out, it's a yes or no kind of deal. There's really no room for a halfway response here. It's no kind of, sort of kind of response. It's really important that we understand that following Jesus is at the heart of any sense of personal calling. Everybody wants to have a sense of like, what am I made to do? What is my purpose in life? Where's my meaning? What are my callings? It always starts with following Jesus. Now, the disciples had time to discover who Jesus was, as I told you here, but then he invites them to go all in and to follow him. So let me just ask you, where are you on that journey? Some of us are at a place where we say, I'm kind of just getting to know who Jesus is. I hear a little bit about what's said in the Bible, but I'm kind of beginning to discover who he is. Does he really have this kind of uncommon wisdom and authority in the things of which you speak of, Pastor? And so you're saying, I'm not really ready. But once you've come to a place of recognizing who Jesus is, there's an invitation that's offered. And that invitation is deserving of all we have, or it's deserving of nothing. And there's no in between. There's no halfway response to his invitation to follow him. And notice his invitation is both really clear and also really vague all at the same time. You see, he says, come with me. That's the clear part. You're going to follow me, go with me. Where are we going? No idea where we're going. We're just going with him. He calls us to follow him and to let him set the direction. Most of us don't want direction, we want directions. I need step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 right now. That's not the way it works. He says, follow me, and I'll give you direction for your next step. Where are we going each step of the way? But any calling starts with following Jesus at the center of it all. But following him is not all that's part of the invitation. Look what it says. Follow me, and I will show you, or I will make you into fishers of people. What else are we called to do? We're called to be remade. Conversion to Jesus is just the first step. Believing in him, accepting his forgiveness and his love for you is really, really important. But over time, Jesus wants to remake us into the people that he's made us to be, into the people that we deep down really long to be. That's why this idea of calling is so vitally linked to following Jesus. Because only as we follow Jesus can we be remade to kind of discover the design that God has for each one of us. The things he's prepared for you and me to live out the callings on our lives. Any honest assessment of the church in America these days says that the church in America is full of converts or believers, but not many people who are really being changed by the gospel, by the power of Jesus. Sadly, the people will say most discipleship systems in the church today are designed to raise up people to run the church, not to be spiritually formed into the image of Jesus. That's one we all need to think about, right? In the first century in Israel, as I said, it was common for a rabbi to have disciples who would travel with him and learn from him. And their goal was to learn his teachings and to master his content. Now notice what Jesus did not say here. He didn't say, come and learn my material. He said, come, follow me, and I will show you, or I will remake you. The goal is not to master his material. The goal is to become like him. It's not about superficial behavior modification, but to be changed at the deepest levels. This is what his invitation is to be about. As the disciples journeyed with Jesus, they marveled at his miracles for sure. But you know what else? They marveled at his life. They marveled at his character. They marveled at his love for people. They saw his remarkable patience with them when they did one stupid thing after another, right? They saw his amazing love for despised people like lepers and prostitutes and tax collectors. They marveled at his deep-seated peace even as he was journeying towards the cross to offer his very life. Jesus wanted to remake them to be like him, to live like him, and do the things that he did. For that to happen, the disciples were going to need to learn some things. They're going to need to unlearn some things, right? But this is all part of the process of being remade from the inside out. Now, some of you might ask, wait a minute, I thought Jesus accepted me as I am. He absolutely does. Jesus takes you just as you are, but he loves you too much to let you stay there. This is part of his heart for us, to remake us into somebody brand new. We're invited to follow Jesus, not if we change, but so we can. The more our lives look like that of Jesus, the more we'll experience the things that we all long for: joy, peace, patience, humility, presence with people. This is critical because for us to accomplish our mission, the thing that we've been called to do, it starts by being remade so that we can, right? Letting the heart of Jesus be built in us so that the heart of Jesus would be seen in us. And as we said last week, our mission in the world is ultimately about who we are even more than what we do, right? If you consider yourself a Christian, honestly ask yourself this question: is my life attractive to others? Do people see something in me that they want? Or have I simply built a set of right beliefs, but really kind of stay in a place where I am unchanged? Last week we said it's not our uniqueness, if you will, but the fullness of Jesus in us that ultimately changes the world. This is what Jesus wants to do. He says, I want to remake you. I want to fill you with my fullness. I want you to look more and more like me with each passing day. Well, getting back to our big theme of personal calling, Jesus seeks to remake you and me so that we can live out our unique callings and purposes. But that's not the end goal either. You see, he invites us to follow him, to be apprenticed to him, so that his example and his spirit living in us remakes us, because it's not just about us, is it? Which leads us to the third part. We are called to pursue people, right? Come follow me, and I will show you, or I will make you into fishers of men. We're invited to follow Jesus and be remade for a purpose, right? In the entire world, in the entire galaxy, we just sang a song about billions of galaxies and stars and everything else. In the entire galaxy, in the entire universe, what is most precious to God? The answer is it's people. We're the only ones that are made in his image. The only ones who've been placed at the crown of creation, who bear all of that dignity and nobility, right? And God invites us in the mission of pursuing what's most precious to him, in the pursuit of people. Your unique calling comes to life within that context. That we have a God who pursues people, and he's got a calling for you in the middle of all of that. Any calling from God ultimately is somehow, some way attached to the pursuit of people. Now, some of you might say, that sounds fantastic, I love that. Others of you are like introverts and go like, I don't know if I want to do that kind of thing. I was thinking this week about when I did an internship in student ministry, years and years and years ago. And this is a large ministry, hundreds of students. And one of the people on the staff was not the leader who was a charismatic speaker, and not many others who invested in students. But one of them was a guy who was kind of I'll just call him kind of a nerdy, somewhat socially awkward administrative guy. And he loved students. And he passionately wanted to see students changed by Christ. But he also knew who he was and the gifts that he had. And so he served in a role of administrator. He managed all of our mission trips, all of our retreats, all of our camps. And he was fantastic at it. And he allowed the ministry to go forward. And so he found his place in this pursuit of people, even as a somewhat socially awkward, introverted guy, where he could give himself to the mission of our God in the pursuit of people. And on top of it, along the way, he began to gather a few other students who were kind of in that same sort of socially awkward category, who had a heart for organization, administration, and he taught them how to do this kind of thing as well. And he invested in them and believed in them. But as I said, any calling from God is ultimately somehow, some way about people. It's about making more and better disciples. And so I want to just say to you, be cautious of anything that sounds like a purpose for you that seems far afield from the call to pursue people, to be fishers of men and women? How many of us at one time had other things that were more important to us than that? Maybe it was the pursuit of money or comfort or awards or popularity or vanity, that at one time those were all bigger pursuits. But over time, as we're remade by Jesus, what happens? We take on his affections, his ambitions, his passions, right? We realize that people are most precious to God, and we rearrange our lives to draw near to people so that they can see Jesus in us. I could talk a lot more about this, but I want you to hear from one of our students who has a calling in the pursuit of people. This is Alyssa. Take a listen.
My name is Alyssa Eyes. I'm a freshman at East Community High School. I help out in Northbridge Kids Ministry, and I attend the Bridge High School Ministry, and I also play guitar for youth group many times. Growing up, going to church all my life, but yet I didn't feel connected with God's community until I came to youth group and got to know more people. Once I got to know people, then I felt the reason that I felt actually loved. I wasn't entirely sure what my purpose was or anything. Constantly I felt this feeling that this journey was beginning in my life. I finally figured out that this was God's journey starting, inviting people to church, and my purpose was starting. I always hesitated because as a child it wasn't like I exactly fit in. I realized that there really was no hesitation needed because God had put this purpose in there, and that it really doesn't matter because I won't be able to reach out to people if I don't put myself out there first, and I can't fit in if I'm going to try to invite people to Christ. Everybody feels those very low moments in their life. But I realized that when I reached out to people, I felt so much more accomplished and positive. But when I talked to people, and I felt that that really was my purpose. Or my friend, when I reached out to her, when I was praying this one Saturday morning, I felt this really strong need to tell her that she was loved. God kept telling me, like urgent, he told me, contact her and tell her that she's loved by the God of the universe. And that she's a daughter of the God of the universe, and that she's loved so dearly. So all weekend, I thought about that, pondered that, and finally, I reached out to her and I told her, I said, you are loved by the God of the universe. I told her what God told me, and she contacted me back and said she had just lost her godfather over the weekend, someone she was really close to, and I had absolutely no idea what was going on in her life, but God knew, and God used me through her, and that was the biggest feeling I'd felt, just these positive, happy moments of reaching out to people. I would speak about Jesus, I'd get them to come to youth group, and then from there, they started liking that, and they'd ask me questions, how I'm so outgoing, how I can talk to people about it, how they can be open, and just answering questions and making them feel more comfortable can help, and also just having a friend in a journey. Like, this journey doesn't have to be alone. Like, sometimes when we were inviting people, we just do it together. So when I go to like Camp Timberley, in retreats, I'll see these people down on their knees completely praising God. I love seeing their absolute joy, and I've realized that as one joy that I can never match anywhere else in the world. No worldly passion can match the joy of seeing people fully give their heart to God. And for me, I felt so much more peace when I know I'm with God. The world has not given me peace, and I've noticed that, and my friends too, that only God can give me full ultimate peace, and that I feel that I don't want to allow other people to have to go through pain and suffering when really all they can have is just God's peace and ultimate love if they only accept Him. So I felt that if I'm given this wonderful love that Jesus gave me, then I figured that other people should know it too. But I want to reach out to people because I don't want to get to heaven and God's disappointed in me. I want to get to heaven and God tell me, I'm proud of you, child. You did what I asked you to. Thank you.
That is a high school freshman. She's made discoveries that many people in their midlife arena are like, where is my sense of meaning? Where's my sense of joy? Where's my sense of purpose in my life? Alyssa's sitting right in the back. Would you stand up, just give a little wave so we can just thank you? So proud of you. She tells the story of being remade and as she follows Jesus and has a heart that's bubbling over for people, right? And in the challenging teen years, when most all of us were just fixated on how to fit in and how to just kind of, be accepted by everybody else, she's speaking openly about her faith in Jesus and what he's done in her life, and she's pursuing her friends. Alyssa says, I've got a calling, at least in this season. It's for a circle of friends where God has placed me. A little sphere at Lakes Community High School. And Jesus has invited her to be his follower and to be remade in part so that he can touch the people that are around her. All this is really pretty foundational, you guys, for understanding our sense of calling, what we're called to do. That this is God's heart. This is the invitation of Jesus that goes out to every one of us. It's part of our calling, right? But now let's just kind of push pause. We'll take a time out here. And let's say, okay, what does this tell me as I start to think about my own individual calling in the midst of all this? Let's see if I give you a couple things to ponder and take home with you today. Number one, we're often called to surrender before our calling is revealed. Jesus invites the fishermen to follow and to be remade, but he doesn't give them a whole lot more information than that. They've learned enough to know that he's not just another good teacher, not some highly moral man. They don't know everything, but they know enough. As I said, he had unique wisdom and power and authority and love and care for people. And so when he calls, they knew obedience was the only appropriate response. Why is this important? I want you to think about this from God's perspective. Many of us are saying, God, I want you to show me what you want me to do with my life. What's my calling, my purpose in this season of my life? God often won't give us a specific calling unless he knows that he's going to get a yes with whatever it is. We demonstrate this when we wholeheartedly obey God in whatever he's calling us to do in this season. Or to put it another way, if we're living in ways that are not aligned with God's desires, if we're choosing to live in a pattern of disobedience, do you think he would entrust a special calling to you or to me? I read an impactful book many years ago called The Making of a Leader. My father-in-law gave it to me. It's written by a guy named Robert Clinton, and what he did was he took all the kind of great leaders in the scriptures and studied them, and then he also studied many of the great leaders in Christian history, and he kind of put them together to try to see, is there any kind of discernible patterns in those whom God uses in significant ways? And he identified 6 phases that every single one of them kind of went through in their journey. And the second phase includes what he calls an obedience check. He said at every point in the development of a fruitful leader, there's a small assignment from God where God essentially checks to see if we'll be faithful and obedient to what he asks us to do. It's a way that we can demonstrate that God can trust us. He says in the book, God has demonstrated that he's trustworthy. He wants to know if he can trust us. Can I trust you with something, a calling? So before you ask for God's help, before you say, God, show me my true calling, here's the question you need to ask yourself. Will I say yes to whatever it is? Whether it's great or small or something I initially thought of or something different, will I say yes to whatever I believe God asked me to do? As Jesus issued this calling to the disciples, they essentially had their own kind of obedience check here. They had to take decisive action to respond to his invitation, which leads to the next one. Living out my calling requires me to reorder my life and priorities. Jesus approaches Peter and Andrew first, if you remember, and it says that they were throwing their nets into the water. This likely means that they were throwing what was called cast nets. They were individual nets that one fisherman would throw out to kind of scoop up, fish in the area where he was standing, right? And it says that Peter and Andrew fished for a living, and so it's a dramatic step that they left their cast nets to go and follow Jesus. But when you get to James and John, it says they're repairing or washing their nets. You didn't have to repair or wash the cast nets. You see, this means that they were most likely repairing or washing what was called trammel nets. Trammel nets were gigantic nets that were stretched between 2 boats. And so a couple of boats would go out, usually at night, with a multiple crew on each of the boats and spread out this huge net and wait during the night for the catch of fish. And so it says that James and John were washing their nets. In 1986, there was an archaeological dig around the Sea of Galilee, and they discovered a boat from about the time of Jesus. They found it was big enough to have multiple crews, that it was equipped for cooking dinner while they're out in the middle of the night or whatever, right? But all this means that when James and John responded to the call of Jesus, they left their boats and they left their father behind. They left multiple boats and crew members and a prosperous family business to say yes to the invitation of Jesus. Now, you might say, is this saying that God wants us all to quit our jobs? I don't think that's the message of this. It's about a matter of priority. Fishing was essentially a way of life. It kind of dominated everything they did. And Jesus was inviting them to a new way of life. I mentioned last week that 9 of us went off to a conference about discipleship and spiritual formation in Portland a few weeks ago. And one of the things that came out of this conference was this kind of idea that the church is failing to build resilient disciples, particularly among our younger generations. And he said, why? Well, they kind of went on to say, our younger generation is unable to hear from God. They are so overwhelmed with anger and division and noise and the invasiveness of technology that it's constantly demanding attention, and there's no room for quiet, no room to hear God's voice. So think about it. If we're people that rarely slow down, rarely quiet ourselves, do you think we'll ever get a sense of what God might have for us? More and more, I'm convinced that people who want to genuinely follow Jesus, who want to live out the callings that he has for their lives, must significantly alter the architecture of their lives in order to do so. You know, the noise and the technology is so invasive and so uninvited that it requires decisive, intentional, countercultural action to reorder life, to genuinely form a relationship with God, to genuinely hear his voice, to follow Jesus and be directed by him. It's a matter of priority. Will we put following Jesus and sensing the leadership of his Spirit as our first priority, or will we try to work it in from time to time when life seems to be less hectic? Following Jesus as a first priority requires reordering our lives so that we can be formed by him. And maybe more better said, to be formed to be like him. Number 3, the more I become like Jesus, the more I'm able to live out my calling. If God wants to use your life for his purposes, he'll remake your life so that you can fit into those purposes. So the first part of the plan is who you're becoming, who we are being, who we are so that we can reflect him. I mean, think about it. If we're just as anxious, just as impatient, just as prideful, just as materialistic as everyone else in the world, why would anyone else be interested in our Savior? Any ability for living out God's purposes involves looking like Jesus in increasing ways with each passing season of our lives. And I'm speaking this, I just feel the weight of conviction as I'm speaking this. We can wait for God to hit us with a lightning bolt and say, here's your true calling, or we can say, the more we're conformed to his image, the more we're able to live out his plans and his purposes for our lives. Number 4, my primary legacy will be measured not by my personal accomplishments, but by the impact of the people I invest in. That's why it's so important that we detach calling from this idea of this quest for personal fulfillment and significance. Because fulfillment and significance are not the goals. They're the byproduct of living out the callings that God has on your life. So often we think that we need to do something noteworthy, something headline-worthy, something far-reaching, something tweet-worthy to feel fulfilled and significant in our lives. But that always leads us down the wrong paths, doesn't it? It always leads us down to pursuing our own dreams, building our own platforms, or even the idea that I'm going to do something great for God. But our God is a pursuer of people, and our calling is always connected to making more and better disciples. It's not about our accomplishments. It's about our faithful investments in other people. Over the last few weeks, a few of the greatest athletes of all times have kind of re-emerged. First one is Derek Jeter. Derek Jeter won 5 World Series as the shortstop of the New York Yankees, He amassed over 3,000 hits, and he made his first appearance at Yankee Stadium since he left at an Old Timers Day just a short time ago. Then there was Tom Brady, winner of 6 Super Bowls. The guy who owns virtually every NFL quarterback record there is, the one who's constantly referred to as the GOAT, right? The greatest of all time. And he was in Foxborough a couple of weeks ago for his jersey retirement ceremony. Now, I saw a little bit of both of these, and they're both very moving at a certain level. And these are 2 of the most accomplished athletes ever. But as I watched their ceremonies, what struck me is how fleeting it all is. How these greats are already fading into oblivion. And it makes you wonder, what is it that really lasts? A calling from God is not about our accomplishments. It's always about our investments in other people. I want to tell you about 2 people named Bob. The first one is a guy named Bob Buford. He's a well-known Christian leader who went home to be with Jesus not too long ago. He authored a book called Halftime. But he's famous for this quote: "The fruit of my life grows on other people's trees." That's one to think about, isn't it? The fruit of my life grows on other people's trees. This is the kind of calling I think Jesus has for each one of us. Pursuing people, investing in others. And when we do this, we may not have celebrated accomplishments that everybody stands up and applauds or have our jersey retired, but the fruit of our lives will be seen in the lives of others. That's Bob Buford. I'll tell you about another Bob. I've told some stories about him in the past in my time at Northbridge. When I was 16 years old, he was 18, a junior college freshman, and he pulled me close to him, pursued me, built a relationship with me, and began to invest in my spiritual growth. He was the first person that really helped me understand that there's a difference between being a believer in Jesus and a follower of Jesus. And he began to equip me and call me and spur me on to follow Jesus wholeheartedly. Well, I haven't seen Bob in 35 years. As I mentioned, we just had a little conference out in Portland a couple weeks ago, and I went out with a group from Northbridge, and I had a group picture taken, and I posted it on my Facebook page. And a few hours later, I got a DM from him, and he said, "I'm 20 minutes from you." I said, "Really?" So we were able to meet early morning for coffee, surprisingly, while we were there. It was unplanned. It was so much fun. This is not a great picture, but here we are out for coffee. But you know what it did? It gave me a chance to thank him for his investment in my life. He's had a lot of challenges and disappointments and setbacks in his life, like all of us have. But he poured himself into me at a critical time. He helped set a direction and a tenor for my life. I told him, whatever fruit comes from my life is really yours. He heeded the call to pursue people, to build into me, to invest himself in making more and better disciples of Jesus. And I told him, your fruit is growing on my tree. Investing in others is never a waste of time. It always matters. It always is seen by God, even when we can't see any of the tangible results. God promises that it is never in vain. In June, I was with a group of pastors at a gathering, and we had a little worship time. And at the end, we were introduced to a song that I had never heard before. And it's a different kind of worship song. Instead of one that we sing to God, it's sort of a song that God sings to us. And it comes right from one of my favorite verses, 1 Corinthians 15:58, which says, "Therefore, my beloved brothers and sisters, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, because your labor in the Lord is never in vain." It's essentially God telling those of us who diligently pursue his calling and invest in others, that in a world that celebrates the noteworthy and the spectacular and the attention-grabbing, God sees your patient investment. God sees the ways that you serve him, and your labor is never in vain. So I asked the music team if they would lead us in singing this. After they're done, our prayer team's going to be down front. We'd love to pray with you, especially if you're kind of going through the process of discerning calling. And my wife and I will be down front. If we haven't had the chance to meet you yet, we would love the privilege to do that. But let's stand together, and as we sing, hear these words that God is singing over your life.
It's not in vain, though the ground underneath you is cursed and stained. Your planting and reaping are never the same. Your labor is not in vain. Your labor is not known. Though the rocks they cry out and the sea it may groan, the place of your toil may not seem like a home. Your labor is not known. And I am with you, and I am with you. Oh, I am with you, and I am with you. For I have called you by name. Your labor is not vain. The vineyards you plant will bear fruit. The fields will sing out and rejoice with the truth. For all that is old will at last be made new. The vineyards you plant will bear fruit. For I am with you, and I am with you. No, I am with you, and I am with you. For I have called you by name. Your labor is not in vain. The houses you labor to build finally with laughter and joy be filled. The serpent that hurts and destroys shall be killed, and all that is broken be healed. And I am with you, and I am with you, and I am with you, and I am with you. For I have called you by name. Your labor is not in vain. Oh, I am with you. Oh, I am with you. Yes, I am with you. Oh, I am with you. For I have called you by name. Your labor is not in vain. Your labor is not in vain. For I have called you by name. One more time. For I have called you by name. For I've called you by name. Your labor is not in vain. What a good truth for us to remind ourselves about, right? For I've called you by name. Your labor is not in vain. So as we leave this building this morning, church, I talked about that our worship is a continuation. But it is also a reminder, this song, that God's presence does not strictly live in this building, but that God's presence lives in our hearts, amen? That we have the Holy Spirit living in our hearts. For he is with us in all that we do, in all that we say. Go in peace this morning. Amen.